Good afternoon. Welcome back to Senate Education on Friday, April 2nd. We have with us members of the Agency of Education to talk about standardized testing. It has been, I know it's been in the press a little bit. I've heard a little bit here and there. And I would just, to be perfectly honest, I don't know everything that's happening. So I'm wondering, Dr. Boucher, if you and your team could just take us through, give us an update. Here we are in the era going through the pandemic. Students have standardized tests. It sounds like those tests may or may not be continuing. And what is that going to look like? Are they going to be on new technologies? Will these scores represent their actual abilities and talents, et cetera? So that's where we're at, and the floor is yours.
Wonderful. Thank you, Mr. Chair. It's delightful to be here, as always, with the Senate Education Committee. For the record, my name is Heather Boucher. I'm the Deputy Secretary for Education. And with me today are Dr. Wendy Geller, who is our Director for our Data Management and Reporting Division, and Dr. Amanda Gorham, who is our State Director of Assessment. So this is perfect. This is exactly what we came in thinking you might want to hear about, which is an update on where all things stand with respect to standardized testing and assessment, particularly this year. So as the committee members may know, USDOE offered some flexibility around standardized testing this year, which we are taking advantage of by submitting a waiver to request the flexibilities that are allowed to us as a state. So just as a brief update, the waiver, we have completed our portion of the waiver at the Agency of Education. So our proposed waiver request to USDOE, it is now posted on our website as of Tuesday, and it will remain on the website for public comment for 30 days, consistent with our usual public comment process, which USDOE is requiring that all states do this. After that, we will review each of the pieces of public comment that we receive. There's an email that's listed right there on the website with the waiver, and we will review those, take a look at those that might cause the agency to retool the proposal as is, and then we submit all of that. So we submit the proposed waiver, and then waiver request, and then all of the public comments to USDOE. So I think one of the big issues that we wanted to clarify right off the bat, and we also are getting a lot of questions, and so it's not surprising at all that committee members might be getting some questions from constituents. There is a misunderstanding potentially that folks believe that there's a misinterpretation between accountability and assessment, and I just want to clarify that. And so we're asking to waive and are allowed to ask to waive features of our state accountability, and I'll explain what that is in just a minute. What we're not allowed to ask a waiver on this year is testing itself. So when you see assessment, that's usually what the average person is thinking about. Is my kid going to do standardized testing this year? The answer is yes. And the answer is they are all going to do standardized testing in every state this year, because USDOE has not allowed any state to successfully argue that they can just forego standardized testing. So I think that's really important right off the bat. It's been a little bit confusing at the federal level because of the change in administration. So some states had actually put in a request to waive standardized testing whole bore, full sail, or as had it happened last year, actually. So that is a further confusion. And they've all been summarily rejected by USDOE. So their waivers have been sent back saying, no, we will not grant you the authority as a state to cancel standardized testing this year. So I just want to make sure that's clear, because I think that's where a lot of the questions are. So we don't have the authority to cancel standardized testing. No state does. U.S. Department of Education is requiring all of us to do some form of standardized testing. Where we do have flexibility, and if the committee is interested, it might be a little bit too much given our time today, but I think I did send over the actual waiver, and folks can take a look at that. And so the pieces that we are actually requesting are all of the allowable flexibilities through the waiver. And you can see that by looking at every box is checked in our request. So what we're actually asking for is, yes, we understand we have to do testing. Can we actually then remove the burden of accountability on our LEAs? And so accountability is what we typically use as the public face of how folks are doing, meaning how districts are doing. So it's it's all of the information that's in the report card. It's how we actually make determinations for who gets additional funding under what are called comprehensive supports. So I know we have newer members and we haven't had a chance to talk about this much, but in the ESSA federal law, the lowest performing 5% of schools on our one component of which is our state assessments are actually identified each 3 years for what are called comprehensive supports, which means they qualify for additional supports from agency staff and additional funding to actually get at typically what are historically gaps for our historically marginalized youth, but also could be due to being in the bottom percent of performance or the bottom 5% in terms of student growth over time. So we, as most other states are, we are requesting that we actually not hold districts accountable this year for the results of these tests. We think that's a fair bargain because we do think that this information that we are receiving can still be useful to schools and districts to actually take a look at, at first, just to take a look at how the achievement test scores looked. We also have some concerns about the reliability and internal validity of these of our results, and we'll take a close look at that, obviously. The other piece I wanted to talk about is that we've also requested that our currently identified schools for comprehensive supports and targeted assistance in our state is what we call schools qualifying for equity supports. So around those marginalized groups, student districts that are actually, it's been a long week, I'm sorry, districts that are actually qualifying for supports around historically underserved populations also qualify for what are called, we call equity supports in our state. So we're actually asking, can we also, in addition to waiving accountability this year, can we also just kind of have a hold harmless in terms of who will be identified as in need of comprehensive supports and targeted supports? The idea there is that because of the pandemic, a good 2 year, at least a year and a half, if not 2 year chunk of the time for currently identified schools in need of comprehensive supports, they haven't had a chance to actually take advantage of their resources and take advantage of supports from the agency that would actually have helped them narrow some of those gaps, if that makes sense. So that's another reason why we're asking if we can just extend who's currently identified for another year. Again, this is very typical of what all states are doing. The only other thing I might say is that, and this Dr. Gorham might walk us through just very briefly. I know she has 2 minutes left. What's in the waiver is actually done from the agency's perspective after looking at a series of potential flexibilities that we considered and thought we could perhaps work with, such as some of those you've mentioned, Mr. Chair, such as remote deployment or administration of the test, such as a shortened test form. And for a variety of reasons, they don't really work for our state. And I will let Amanda maybe take a quick pass at that. I know you have to go, but I think that would be useful for the committee to know as well.
Great.
Sure. I'm happy to speak to the flexibilities. So back in the fall, we started having some conversations on a very frequent basis with our test vendors about the ways that we might be able to adjust the administration of our assessments this year, because we began very early on planning for all possible eventualities, any circumstances that we might find ourselves in at this time in the year. So very early on, we were informed that there were possibilities such as a remote administration, a shortened test form, changes to test windows. What we found over time, and this was really consistent regardless of the conditions, the remote administration posed some privacy concerns. And some equity concerns. To administer a test remotely, every student needs a stable internet connection for an extended duration of time, as well as a microphone and a computer, where the teacher is through a webcam watching the student take the test. They also need certain conditions in their home, like a quiet space, right? Or if they're a young student, they might need a parent to help them move through the assessment and use the technology. And so we found that to be really cumbersome and also not accessible to all of our students. There are also some sort of technical and validity related concerns, but it seemed like the practical risks associated were substantial enough on their own. With shortening the test, that option was only available for some of our assessments. It was not available to students who need accommodations on the assessment, our English learners. And so there was some pretty significant equity concerns, and again, also logistical concerns. And when we talk about moving the test window, our test window is already 3 months long. And so it's considerably a bit more roomy than really any other state in terms of the length of the window, and moving it into the summer or even in the fall. There's definitely some consequences that could be considered for that. And we felt like from, identifying values of equity and student well-being in all of our decision-making, that moving forward with a standard administration of this assessment was going to be least burdensome, least stressful, and also have the best chance of producing the most useful information, considering the parameters that are set by the United States Department of Education. And so here we are, a little bit into the test window, and now providing technical assistance to the field. So there we go.
I'm not sure if this is for Dr. Boucher or Dr. Gorman, but what did we do last year? Same thing, similar situation? No, go ahead.
Sorry. No, we the U.S. Department of Education allowed states to just waive assessments. We just didn't do them at all last year.
Thank you. That's good. That's helpful to know. Senator Hooker.
Yes, thank you. So Dr. Boucher, what will happen to those kids who are going to school remotely now? Will they have to go in to take a test? I know that in our area, it looks as if there's going to be testing this spring. What will happen? And I know the 95% requirement of kids testing. I mean, will they be exempt? Will they, is it possible that it's just you're not going to have to adhere to that?
Thank you, Senator Hooker. Great question. And that is one of the parts that I didn't mention, which is part of the accountability waiver request is a request to waive the 95% requirement. How that actually looks practically on the ground, if Amanda, do you have just a couple more minutes just to talk that through? I know we have had several students already testing who you might know if some of them are remote or not and coming in. I'm not sure, but that practical piece, that's exactly why I have Dr. Gorham here, because she's more close to the ground than I am.
I'm so happy to respond to that. So in terms of the ways that we are sort of positioning the requirement to participate in assessment this year, we have issued guidance to the field that, as in any other year, every student must be offered the assessment. And for students that are learning remotely, you could reasonably say that what that looks like is a school providing the testing dates to the family and saying that they would need to come in for testing. We also understand that there may be circumstances where students are learning remotely because they have significant medical concerns and they, haven't been outside their home in 12 months. And so we've worked with our test vendors to develop some forms of documentation for non-participation, where we're sort of coding these instances where there really is this, logical rationale of why students are learning remotely and also cannot assess in person. And so that's not a federally recognized exemption, but we're doing our best to make sure that we have some qualitative data to understand instances of non-participation. And this transfers into that accountability piece. The 95% participation threshold is really, it's a consequence associated with low participation. So the participation requirements, practically speaking, are, to paraphrase, any student who is publicly funded and or enrolled in a public school must participate if they're in one of the applicable grade levels in statewide assessments. So that participation requirement still holds this year, which is why we've advised the field to offer the assessment to all students typically required to assess. The 95% participation threshold that would be waived through this process that Dr. Boucher has spoken about would relax the consequences associated with low participation. So at a school level or a district level, they get an average scaled score. And if the participation rate is below 95%, that average score is weighted by the participation rate. So that's where that piece comes in. And so if this waiver is approved by US Ed, then that will not hold this year. There would not be consequences in terms of accountability associated with a lower participation rate. We do anticipate having some issues with participation this year because, again, we are keeping student safety and health in mind as we administer these assessments. And there will not be these consequences if the waiver is accepted by the United States Department of Education.
I think one of my concerns, and I think it has been answered by Dr. Gorham, and that is, I hate to see a child get tossed onto a computer unless they really not only had good access, internet access, but also had a level of fluency with the computer. I mean, because of issues of inequity, there are children out there that I'm sure spend a lot of time on the computer, and then children that don't have as much time. And it sounds as though that that is being addressed. Would you agree, Dr. Gorham?
I believe that that is being addressed to the best of our ability. Again, given the parameters that we're working with under US Ed, equity has been sort of our guidepost in all of the decisions that we've made thus far. And we really feel like, given the circumstances and the requirements that are set by US Ed, we have made the best decisions possible in terms of equity, and also in terms of being able to look at these results through the lens of equity, to start to understand sort of the story of what happened this year and even a little bit into last year, so that we can start to move forward.
Okay. Other questions, please? Any final comments or other things? Dr. Geller, anything that you would like to add?
No, I think Deputy Secretary Boucher and Dr. Gorham have done a great job. I think it really covers the care that we have approached this situation with this year. And I think there's no better team than the one that Dr. Gorham's leading at the moment. We're very glad that she's here with us, and we're very fortunate to have someone of her caliber and expertise leading the crew now.
Great. It was nice to hear. Thank you. Dr. Boucher, any final words?
Nope. I think, as Dr. Geller just said, I think that we have covered what we wanted to with the committee. Certainly always open. If folks have follow-up questions, please don't hesitate. I'm actually really pleased to let you get to meet both Dr. Geller, if you haven't yet, and Dr. Gorham. I don't want Wendy to sell herself short. She's a pretty fantastic component of our wonderful data division as well.
Wonderful. Well, Doctor, thank you very much for a very lively, important, informative conversation.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Have a great weekend, all.
Thank you.
Committee, I think we're just waiting on Jeannie. I know that you mentioned our next lineup was going to be on S100.
Yes, and I've emailed them. I haven't heard back from them. I told them that we were ready for them.
Okay, so why don't we come back in 5 minutes?